two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. A pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?
For William Shakespeare, 1603 was a very good year.
By a name, I know not how to tell thee who I am.
Writer, actor, director, he was now the artist-in-chief of Elizabethan England.
Who's there? I just...
He'd created some of the greatest characters in literature: Othello and Iago, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet. In the Elizabethan police state, theatre wasn't just entertainment, it was popular and political. It had a thrilling and dangerous power.
Shakespeare, remember, is still only in his late 30s. If he'd have died at this point, he'd still be the greatest English poet. But now he goes further, out of his experience of life and the turbulent times through which he lived, the new worlds and the lost worlds. He pulls it all together in some of the greatest works of literature ever written. And it's that story and the mysterious end to his career that we're going to uncover in this last stage of our search for William Shakespeare.
In March 1603, the Elizabethan age came to an end. At her palace here on the River Thames at Richmond, the last of the Tudors, Queen Elizabeth I, lay dying.
Her old friend, Sir Robin Carey, was with her in her last hours, and he describes how she took his hand in her bony fingers and wrung it hard and let forth 40 or 50 piteous sighs, the like of which, he said, I never heard from her, except when the Queen of Scots was beheaded.
In her 45-year reign, Elizabeth had steered England's change from a Catholic to a Protestant nation. She'd seen her people through the ordeal of the Spanish Armada, but she had no heir. So now, in an ironic twist, the crown was to pass to the son of her enemy, Mary, Queen of Scots, King James of Scotland. James was a Protestant with a Catholic wife, lazy and fearful, but a born compromiser, which was no bad thing in 1603. As James made his way down from Scotland, poets spoke of a coming golden age, a united Britain with old quarrels left behind.
King James fancied himself as a philosopher prince. He'd written books and he valued poets. And the artists and intellectuals down in London liked the sound of that. Cool Britannia. And almost immediately, by royal appointment, Shakespeare's company were made the King's Men. So William found himself a servant on the royal payroll.
And what did Shakespeare think of the new age? Well, don't forget, as a boy, he'd been raised in a Catholic family, and he'd learned early on to keep his public career separate from his private beliefs.
Funny thing is, he lives in London for 25 years, but you can never find him in the parish records, even where it was compulsory. I think he lived a double life between London and Stratford, and the religious thought police could never pin him down.
But we can still find him. He appears in a court case in a dispute over a dowry, which shows that in 1603 he was lodging with the Mountjoy family, who made headdresses for the rich. He'd been the go-between in the marriage of their daughter to their apprentice. The Mountjoys lived by London Wall at the corner of Silver Street and Monkwell, or as Londoners like to call it, Muggle Street. And the Mountjoys were Huguenots, French Protestants exempt from the laws on church attendance. Ideal, perhaps, for a man who liked to keep to himself.
And there they are, well, the remains of them. That was St. John Zachary, it went in the Great Fire, and that's St. Anne's there, which went in the Great Fire, but they rebuilt it. And if you cross over into Noble Street, the place where Shakespeare lived is dead ahead. Don't be too disappointed. And here's the churchyard of St. Olaf. This was Shakespeare's parish church, tiny little church with its churchyard. He looked out of his bedroom window onto this. This was where Mr. and Mrs. Mountjoy's daughter married Stephen, their apprentice, in November 1604. And their house was right on the corner there of Silver Street and Monkwell Street, which makes it just about underneath the dual carriageway of London Wall.
But when King James finally arrived in London, William was to find himself in a very public role.
This is the account book for the royal entry of James I into London in May 1604. And these are the issues of scarlet cloth. And here they are. The players: William Shakespeare, Augustine Phillips, John Hemmings, Richard Burbish. They're all issued with a 4-yard roll of scarlet cloth. And the question is, why? Come see Christopher.
Christopher Allen?
Yes.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah.
First in the shop, sir. Turn right to the reception.
Thank you very much indeed. Brilliant.
Ede and Ravenscroft are the Queen's robe-makers. They've been doing coronations since the 17th century.
Well, it's nice to know these places still exist, isn't it? Absolutely wonderful. Hello, good morning.
4.5 yards of cloth is sufficient to make a doublet and breeches, which would have been the formal dress of that period. See, for instance, on this picture here, this would be very similar indeed to the outfit that Shakespeare would have used for the coronation, which would be made from the 4.5 yards.
It was the summit of Shakespeare's social climbing. The son of a Stratford Glover, already a gentleman with a coat of arms, was now in the King's court in scarlet livery.
Here's a selection of scarlet materials. To start off with, the one that we have here is the wool material, and this is very much the material I suspect would have been the one that would have been used by Shakespeare for the coronation.
This is the kind of woolen cloth that
Yes,
Shakespeare
this
would
is
have
exactly the type of material that would be used for that purpose, yes. Now, we have here a piece of crimson rather than scarlet velvet. This is silk velvet, and this would be used to make coronation robes.
So James I would have worn something like this
Yes.
himself then?
Yes.
Yeah. Gosh, it's a sort of sensuous art as well, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
King James entered London under specially built triumphal arches topped by obelisks, towering 70 feet over the streets. And William's role in all this pomp was to be one of the ushers who carried the canopy over the king. But to him, it was just empty show, as he tells us in his sonnets.
Were it aught to me, I bore the canopy, with my extern the outward honouring, or laid great bases for eternity, which prove more short than waste or ruining. No, time, thou shalt not boast that I do change. Thy pyramids built up with newer might to me are nothing novel, nothing strange. They are but dressings of a former sight. For thy records and what we see do lie, made more or less by thy continual haste. This I do vow, and this shall ever be. I will be true, despite thy scythe and thee.
But whatever William's private thoughts, he had to earn a crust, and his duty now was to please the king, especially in the long winter holidays.
So from now on, Christmas for Shakespeare and the King's Men meant providing entertainment for the royals for 2 weeks at a stretch.
The court was a vast industry where consumption was nothing if not conspicuous.
These kitchens are designed to feed 600 people twice a day. 12 cooks with teams of up to 10 people underneath them, all of them working away every day from dawn till nearly dusk to produce these 2 meals. It will have looked more like an army catering corps than anything else. Hot, loud, dirty, people everywhere screaming and shouting at each other just to get the food through here and out to the table.
It's like a plague of locusts arriving on a town, really, isn't it? You know.
You've got fresh meat, you've got fresh dishes and lots of it. The whole idea is that the king's saying, look at me, I can have things from everywhere and you're getting it to eat.
And after the feasting, the master of revels called on Shakespeare. In the Public Record Office, David Thomas showed me the list of plays performed for James that first Christmas.
Measure for Measure on Boxing Day. The Play of Errors.
The Comedy of Errors.
Love's Labour's Lost. Got a few old shows getting a revival here, aren't they? And in this column, the names of the poets.
The poets. So we've got 2 references to Shakespeare, spelled Shaxbeerd, which is extraordinary spelling.
This isn't a Scot who's just come down with James spelling it Shakespeare.
To help us imagine those Christmases, the Royal Shakespeare Company came to Hampton Court to play where Shakespeare played.
But I, with wings as swift as meditation or the thoughts of love, may sweep to my revenge.
What light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun.
The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed.
Let fame, that all hunt after in their lives, live registered upon our brazen tombs, and then grace us in the disgrace of death.
I think you're in a BLT. It looked like a BLT.
We are doing in Stratford this season 151 performances. They would do 150 performances over exactly that same period of time. But whereas we this year are doing 5 plays, they did 38 plays, 21 of which were new.
But beyond the glamour of the court, England was still a troubled land. In the country, religious and social divisions still simmered. In 2 years, the initial optimism about James had gone. Catholic hopes of religious freedom had faded. There were eclipses and omens. Astrologers foretold that truth and justice shall be oppressed, and charity wax cold. Then in November 1605, the government announced it had foiled a plot aimed at the very heart of the English state. It was nothing less than a Jacobean 9/11. In the cellars beneath Parliament, royal guards found 36 barrels of gunpowder from the government's own stores. The plotters' plan, they said, had been to blow up the royal family and the Parliament of England. To this day, no one knows how far the plot was real and how far a trap to smoke out enemies of the state. But it didn't matter. As James said, we dinna need the papists now.
James made a speech to Parliament saying that he'd been inspired by God to foresee the plot. And then, in the language of today's news bulletins, announced that there would be no safe haven for the terrorists. They would be hunted down one by one, and that you were either with us or you were with the terrorists.
And who were the terrorists? The old Catholic gentry from the Stratford region. The Grants were business friends of Shakespeare's father. The Winters, Treshams and Catesbys, disillusioned young men of the highest promise, hoping to restore the old faith.
plotters were Warwickshire men, of course, and Shakespeare must have known them. He was related to the Catesbys and the Treshams distantly through his mother's family. So he must have watched the unfolding climax to this tragedy with a kind of horrified fascination.
The plotters were tried and executed, and ever since the British have burned them in effigy on bonfire night. For Catholic England, it was the end of history.
Of course, the Gunpowder Plot and the trials that followed caused an absolute sensation, and the Elizabethan entertainment industry reacted fast, just as it would today. On the stage in London, a host of plays appeared, packed with anti-papist rhetoric. Plays with titles such as The Whore of Babylon and The Devil's Contract. And it was in this frenzied artistic atmosphere that Shakespeare sat down to write what's perhaps his most topical play, a play packed with that paranoia and frenzy, a play about assassination of kings and supernatural power and evil, Macbeth.
If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the...
Just think about it. Macbeth is about the murder of a Scottish king, played before a Scottish king. And in it, Shakespeare takes us into the mind not of the king, but of his murderer, and shows us how a good man fell into evil by coveting the crown.
Had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. My husband...
I have done the deed. Didst thou not hear a noise?
I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry. Did not you speak?
When?
No.
As I descended. Who lies in the second chamber?
Donald Bain.
This is a sorry sight.
A foolish thought to say, a sorry sight.
Yes, one did laugh in his sleep, and one cried murder, that they did wake each other. I stood and heard them, but they did say their prayers and addressed them again to sleep.
There are two lodged together.
One cried, God bless us, and amen the other, as they had seen me with these hangman's hands. Listening their fear, I could not say amen when they did say God bless us.
Consider it not so deep.
Wherefore could not I pronounce amen? I had most need of blessing, and amen stuck in my throat.
These deeds must not be thought after these ways, so it will make us mad.
Methought I heard a voice cry, sleep no more. Macbeth doth murder sleep.
In the months after the plot, pressure from the Puritans led to a new act of censorship against the theatre. William was forced to rewrite or face a £10 fine for every profanity in his plays. Sermonizers and religious extremists called for the theatres to be closed down altogether, and William was even attacked as a papist's poet, ever feigning. But laws can never stop ideas once they've been let loose. The English were passionate about their theatre and their books, and by then publishing too was a massive business.
Around the two sides of the cathedral here, there were shops built up against the cathedral wall. Right. In fact, we stand about here, we're on the site of the Tiger's Head, which is where William Astley, one of the partners who published Henry IV Part 2 and Much Ado, had his shop more or less under us right here. On the north side of this big open space, running from Pissing Alley, which was about there, all the way around to the northeast gate of the cathedral, there was a 300-foot range of buildings, 3 to 4 stories tall, with garrets above, end-to-end bookshops. Some of them with quite long frontages.
Oh, so this is not a primitive cottage industry, is it, by any means?
Not in the least.
The guardians of the publishing world were the Stationers' Company. They're still here by St. Paul's. Their job was to ensure political and religious conformity in books. to make sure nothing seditious was published. And not surprisingly, the top 10 bestsellers in Shakespeare's day were all religious books. All authoritarian states, of course, seek to control the written word, especially with a technology like printing, which is open to all. Several of Shakespeare's history plays were published with controversial scenes cut, and in their archive, the stationers keep the licensing records of their first printing. So this is the register for the stationers' company in Shakespeare. This is wonderful. So the plays are listed individually here then.
The entrance here begins. Andrew Wise entered for his copy a book entitled The History of Henry IV with his battle at Shrewsbury against Henry Hotspur of the North with the conceited mirth of Sir John Falstaff. That's the play that's being entered.
And no mention of the author here.
So often you don't get any attribution of authorship because the author didn't count. There was no commercial advantage in it.
Shakespeare's name is not yet enough to guarantee that anything will sell. But Falstaff is. Now, Falstaff was a major selling point, which is why Falstaff is right there in the entry on the title page.
So you can read about your favourite character.
Exactly, yes. Yes. All three of his bestsellers were history plays.
Yes.
The other two are Richard III, which sells because Richard is such a wonderful, devilish character, and Richard II, which was controversial because of the abdication. Those are the three best-selling Shakespeare plays.
History was one of William's obsessions as a writer, and it's easy to see why. Writing critically about contemporary politics was impossible, so history was a way of articulating the pressure of the time. But just how hard it was to walk the tightrope can be seen in a manuscript in the British Library in London. The book is a history play about the Catholic St. Thomas More, who was executed by Henry VIII for opposing his divorce of Catherine of Aragon. The censor had demanded rewrites, and it now turns out that some of them are in Shakespeare's own hand. We've got 3 pages, nearly 150 lines, from the play of Sir Thomas More, a show that was never done. The censor stopped it, and Shakespeare was one of 5 collaborators. It's an insight into Shakespeare as a jobbing playwright. And how do we know it's him? Well, the handwriting matches his, and the spellings. Shakespeare never lost some of his idiosyncratic Warwickshire spellings. And there's a great one here. Silence, he spells S-C-I-L-E-N-S. Spells it time and time again that way in his Henry IV plays, and here it is again. And what's so wonderful about this is that the scene that Shakespeare was called upon to write is about a race riot, anti-immigrant riot, anti-refugees and asylum seekers. It's the kind of scene that we see all the time in today's world, from Bosnia and Kosovo to Afghanistan. The poor strangers are imagined with their babies on their backs and no home to go to. And More confronts the racist mob and tells them to take the stranger's case and to look at their own mountainish inhumanity. The year after the Gunpowder Plot, right across the land there was a religious clampdown by the government. Everyone now had to take Protestant Easter Communion or face crippling fines. And here in Stratford, among those summoned for refusing, was William's 23-year-old daughter, Susanna. It was around this time that Shakespeare wrote one of his greatest and darkest plays. The show was played before King James at court at Christmas 1606. It's about how kings should live up to the ideals of a just Christian society.
Know that we have divided in 3 our kingdom, and 'tis our fast intent to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger strengths, while we, unburdened, crawl towards death.
On the face of it, Lear is just a fairy story about a foolish king whose vanity destroys his kingdom.
Which of you shall we say doth love us most? Goneril, Our eldest born, speak first.
Sir, I love you more than words can wield the matter.
But of course it goes much deeper than that. It's not that Lear is meant to be taken as a portrait of James, but in the play William intended to catch the conscience of the king.
Then poor Cordelia. And yet not so, since I am sure my love's more richer than my tongue.
Now, our joy. Although the last, not least, what can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak.
Nothing, my lord.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Well, nothing will come of nothing. Speak again.
Only when the king has lost everything does he realize the folly of his ways.
Blow wind and crack your cheeks! Rage! Blow! You cataracts and hurricanes, spout! Till you have drenched the steeples!
Kings are gods on earth, James said, and writers shouldn't meddle with their deepest mysteries. But he let Shakespeare do it.
Here I stand, your slave, a poor, infirm, weak, and betrayed old man!
King Lear was understood by Shakespeare's contemporaries as a spiritual commentary on the times. And the fact that the company played it at one of the great Christmas festivals before King James and his entire court only shows how far they thought they could go with their patrons and how far their patrons were prepared to go with them.
Unlike fairy stories, Lear has no happy ending.
No life. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou'lt come no more. Never, 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 never.
Pray you undo this button. Thank you, sir.
Look on her, look. Her lips. Look there. Look there.
He faints. My lord.
Shakespeare, of course, was writing for his time, not ours. But in his depiction of human cruelty, terror and atrocities, he seems to speak as much for our times as for his own.
The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. The oldest hath borne most, we that are young shall never see so much nor live so long.
At this point in his life as an artist in London, Shakespeare was working at the grandest level imaginable. But back home in Stratford, there was still his family. And early the next year, 1607, his daughter Susanna fell in love and married. William would soon be a grandfather. His son-in-law was a doctor, and he came from the other side of England's religious divide.
Dr. John Hall was an interesting man, not least because he was a Puritan. Moderate Puritan, but a Puritan nonetheless. But he seems to have been a decent sort. His casebooks show that he treated everybody, including Romish priests. So perhaps, as with so many families in England, reconciliation of the old to the new began at home.
But even at home, revolution was in the air. The rural poor were on the march. They called themselves the Diggers of Warwickshire. "We too are true-hearted members of the whole body of the Commonwealth," they wrote in their manifesto, "but our flesh is being ground on the whetstone of poverty." The week of Susanna's marriage, 3,000 diggers marched across Warwickshire, protesting about the enclosure of their common fields by rich landowners. The day after Susanna's wedding, the diggers were crushed, their leaders hanged, drawn and quartered. A civil war was just over the horizon, and Susanna would live to see it. When he returned to London, William put the diggers' moral case into the political thriller he wrote that year, Coriolanus, still experimenting, still pushing his audience. And at that time, he and the company decided to open a second theatre over the river in the city. In 1608, they got the lease on the derelict hall of the old Catholic monastery of the Blackfriars.
This is the site of Shakespeare's theatre in the Blackfriars. It was tucked away in a warren of alleys in the poshest part of the city. They'd had their eyes on the site for a long time, but the locals had refused to give them planning permission. They didn't want hoi polloi like actors in the neighbourhood. But when they did get hold of it, it was a real money spinner. They could charge what they liked almost for the seats. And one contemporary says that in one winter here, they made £1,000 more than they did at the Globe, the other side of the river. In Elizabethan London, that was serious money.
The idea was that the Blackfriars would be their indoor winter home. Renovating the hall was a huge investment, and the opening was delayed a year by plague. But it was a great move for Shakespeare and his old friends. And it led Shakespeare into a different kind of drama.
Have a pee. I'm comfortable with these braces. What? I've got a vest. Show them one of my vests.
The Blackfriars was small, but it enabled him to control all aspects of the play.
Had the advantage, of course, of intimacy. There were no seagulls flying overhead, no loose-bowled starlings. It was an intimate space, and it was a space to which, to some extent, of course, you could control the lighting. They were able to open the casements and bring in daylight. There's that bit in Midsummer Night's Dream where they talk about opening up the casement and finding out whether the moon shines that night. That changed the nature of the plays in all sorts of different ways, making them perhaps darker, making them physically darker, and perhaps also changed the nature of what it was that they performed in those spaces.
Ha! Hark. A sound from heaven. Do you hear nothing?
This is a strange place to hear music in.
This song is all we have from Shakespeare's lost Blackfriars play, Cardenio.
Killed with disgrace.
This is the music for Shakespeare's lost play, Cardenio, which was based on the new translation of Don Quixote, which had just come out. The play was done at court in 1613, and here's Robert Johnson's music for it, based on the Shelton translation. Woods, rocks and mountains, and you desert places, where naught but bitter cold and hunger dwells.
Woods, rocks, and mountains, and you desert places.
The spirit of some hapless man that died and left his love hid in a faithless woman sure haunts these mountains.
So with candlelight, boy singers and Italian-influenced music, this was Shakespeare's new style.
Is this not heavenly?
I never heard the like, sir.
The Blackfriars shows raised the social status of actors, and the sure sign that they'd arrived was that they began to have their portraits painted.
Yep. Who set up his college here in 1619, and just almost a kind of accident, he left paintings as well.
With actors?
With actors.
Nathan Field. This is one of Shakespeare's boy actors.
Right.
God, it's quite a haunting picture, isn't it?
It's the ancestor of a kind of Hollywood heartthrob portrait. This is Tom Cruise of his day.
Come to bed eyes, aren't they?
And these haven't been to bed eyes, belong to the star of the age. The man who played Hamlet, Macbeth and Lear, Shakespeare's favourite actor.
So this is Richard Burbage, we think, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, the face that launched 1,000 hits. I suddenly was thinking, yeah. Interesting comparison with the famous picture of, the supposed picture of Shakespeare.
That's right. Yeah.
From roughly the same time.
Mm-hmm.
There's some suggestion that Burbage might have painted this too. Is it conceivable these two could be by the same person?
They probably are very similar, actually. This reproduction is slightly smaller than the actual dimensions of the painting, but if you actually just bear in mind that this is smaller than it should be and place the head over the reproduction, they probably are actually similar sizes, these two heads.
Yeah.
Likenesses were very popular at that time.
And this class of people for the first time, not just aristocrats.
Yes.
The actors now mixed with the intellectual avant-garde. They met at London's most famous literary inn, close by St. Paul's, the Mermaid. Here Shakespeare swapped ideas with translators, scientists and explorers. And one day in 1611, one of the shareholders of a New World expedition slipped him a suppressed document. A tale of shipwreck in the Bermudas. And it gave William the cue for his last solo play, one in which many have detected more than a hint of autobiography.
I have bedimmed the noontide sun, called forth the mutinous winds, and twixt the green sea and the azured vaults set roaring war. Graves at my command have waked their sleepers, oped and let them forth by my so potent art.
The shareholder's story caught Shakespeare's imagination with its tale of visions, cannibals, and enchanted islands. But Shakespeare found something else in that tempest. There are storms in all his last plays, storms which destroy the most precious things in life: love, family, friendship. But in The Tempest, as in all his late plays, the survivors are redeemed by time and their children, which leaves us feeling that he's taken us on a very personal voyage.
In the end, we mustn't forget the story. It is, after all, about a dad who's a control freak, full of bottled-up aggression, who wants to take revenge on his enemies, but in the end forgives them and is reconciled when his daughter marries the son of his enemy. And with that, he announces that he's going to throw away forever his supernatural powers as a magus of words and magic.
But this rough magic I here abjure. And when I have required some heavenly music, which even now I do, to work mine end upon their senses, that this airy charm is for. I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book.
So is Prospero Shakespeare? Did he drown his book, pack it in and go home? The next spring we know for sure that he's living back in Warwickshire, and he's buying more land up here on Welcome Hill. So was this the long-planned retirement, the chance to return at last to his wife Anne? In their terms, he was well into middle age now, and I wonder whether maybe he felt that he'd been left behind by the new age, that his knotty, personal style no longer quite sat with the new taste, the younger generation. Conscious too may be that his father's world, the world he was born into, had gone forever. He was an old Elizabethan now.
There's an interesting parallel between Shakespeare and the great Russian novelist Tolstoy. Tolstoy had also written with painful clarity about death and human suffering in his work. He too had lost his young son, and at the age of 50, the same age as Shakespeare, he came to the sudden realization that life was meaningless, that it was time to die. Not because he felt he was finished in his body, but because he felt there was nothing left to live for, that writing no longer gave him happiness. And his solution was to come out into the countryside and throw himself into the mundane reality of soil and seed. And I wonder whether Shakespeare might have been similar. You think of the sudden fade out of his career, and then think of all those purchases of pieces of land, of tithes, of field strips. Perhaps it was an earthy substitute for his airy art.
In spring 1613, there's a further curious clue to the offstage Shakespeare, the man with one eye on his retirement. It comes from the country estate of the Duke of Rutland. While the diggers were marching, the aristocrats acted out nostalgic fantasies of the golden age of chivalry, fancy dress jousts celebrating King James's auspicious rule. Like the rich today, they hired top showbiz talent. The best, of course, was Shakespeare and Burbage. One of their sidelines was designing knightly shields painted with impresos, fancy emblems with verses. One was for an old theatre fan, the Earl of Rutland, and the present Duke has still got the bill.
31st of March. To Mr. Shakespeare, in gold, about my lord's impreso. And Mr. Burbage for painting and making it in gold. So Shakespeare paid in gold for designing this, perhaps doing a motto and a poem with it. I imagine perhaps the Earl of Rutland would have not only appeared with his impreso, his motto on his shield, but actually delivered a few lines to the king.
That would have kept him in food and water for a while, anyway.
Yeah. So a little extension to his house in Stratford, perhaps. Yeah. So this was a nice little urner for Shakespeare on the side.
But as always with Shakespeare, there's a twist. In 1613, just when we think he's settled back in Stratford, he buys a big house in London when he no longer needs one. The house was here in the Blackfriars, and it was a place with a history. it had been well known to the government spies as a Catholic safe house.
So the theatre and the Catholic community are quite closely...
They're interwoven, The same artists working in the Blackfriars area for their religion were also working on the theatre too. It was a liberty, an enclave of freedom, of religious toleration. Here is the side of the wardrobe on one side. There would have been a bridge of sighs across the middle, connecting Shakespeare's property.
Richard Wilson lives next door to Shakespeare's last London home.
And Shakespeare's house just about here.
The building that Shakespeare bought in 1613 stood on both sides, and it was a substantial building.
The Cockpit Inn stands on the site today.
The Shakespeare industry.
Hello, could we maybe have a peep downstairs?
Yeah, sure, no problems at all.
Now they talk about a network of underground passages, don't they? You lead on.
Well, the foundations would have been medieval before they were Elizabethan. They talk about prehistoric sites as well. We know that in Roman times there was a pizza house here. It's a classic pub cellar now.
Yeah.
But the space itself, the cavity itself, probably much of the brickwork and the foundations would have been Elizabethan. This is the cellar of Shakespeare's London house. And before that, of course, it was the cellar of the Dominican Priory.
The reports of the government's spies say the secret tunnels went down to the river and were used by the Catholic underground.
So let me make sure I've understood this. At the point when we think Shakespeare has retired and is living in Stratford, he comes back here, buys a big house, which has been known to the government prior to that as a safe house for the Catholic underground.
He's buying not just any house, he's buying the epicentre of Catholic London.
Shakespeare's a slippery customer, isn't he, don't you think?
Shakespeare's presence in the house is one of the most slippery things of all.
Now, of course, he may just have missed the theatre. But with his family history, I have a sneaking feeling there's more to it than that. What we do know is that the same year, collaborating with new young talent, he picks up his pen again. And what a tale he chose.
Say, Henry, King of England, come into the court.
Henry, King of England, come into the court.
Here.
Say, Catherine, Queen of England, come into the court.
Catherine, Queen of England, come into the court.
The trial and divorce of Henry VIII's Queen Catherine of Aragon had begun England's split with Rome 80 years before. It had taken place in the very hall in the Blackfriars, which was now Shakespeare's theatre. And so Shakespeare finally turned to the events which had shaped his own life, the Reformation of Henry VIII, and he called it, teasingly, All is True.
Sir, in what have I offended you? What cause has my behavior given to your displeasure, that thus you should proceed to put me off and take your good grace from me? Heaven witness!
Just imagine how the old Elizabethans in the audience felt watching this.
When was the hour I ever contradicted your desire, or made it not mine too? Which of your friends have I not strove to love, although I knew he were mine enemy? Wherefore I humbly beseech you, sir, to spare me, till I may be by my friends in Spain advised, whose counsel I will implore. If not, in the name of God, your pleasure be fulfilled.
So for one last time, William had returned to the history of England, its greatness and its tragedies. In 1614, during a performance of Henry VIII, the Globe was accidentally burnt down. The rebuilding cost the shareholders a small fortune, and perhaps that's when William sold his share and finally bowed out of the theatre. He returned to the small town life of Warwickshire, seeing old friends, business trips to London with his son-in-law, a gentleman at ease with life, a pillar of the local church and society. And then, early in 1616, he fell ill. He was still only 51.
Story goes that Shakespeare died from a fever contracted after a drinking binge with the Warwickshire poet Michael Drayton and his old mate Ben Jonson. And that story's usually dismissed as part of the Shakespeare myth, but it has a ring of truth about it. They were all drinkers. You drank as part of your diet from childhood in those days, and acting, as today, must have been a high-risk profession. Ben Jonson wrote whole poems about his favourite pub crawls. And when you think about it, 25 years spent lodging in inns in London as a single man. It's almost inconceivable that Shakespeare wasn't a drinker. And maybe drink did get him in the end.
I'm slightly nervous with as documents go. This is pretty pretty unique document, isn't it?
Well, this is Shakespeare's will.
Wow. I, William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon, the county of Warwickshire, gentleman.
The bulk of the estate goes to Susanna, his elder daughter. There are some bequests to 3 of his fellow actors. My fellows, John Hemmings, Richard Burbage and Henry Condell. 26 shillings and 8pence to buy rings.
What did he leave for his wife?
Well, we can see over the page here. And this is the famous entry. Give unto my wife my second best bed with the furniture.
And that's all?
And that's all.
People say the will shows he didn't love Anne, that he resented the shotgun marriage that had tied him down over 30 years before. But maybe there's a different story back at Anne's house, where William came courting when he was 18. Anne's father left 2 4-poster beds in his will, on condition they stayed in the family. There's only one in her brother's will, but 2 were handed down in the house, and they're still here.
So when William and Anne first got married, did Anne borrow a bed from the family home here and take it to set up house with her teenage husband? If so, this could be their marriage bed. The secrets of any marriage are hidden from outsiders, aren't they? And for all we know, he loved her to the end and still felt on his deathbed, as he had said on their marriage night, that Anne saved my life.
Shakespeare died on St. George's Day, 23rd of April 1616. The Stratford Register records his burial. William Shakespeare, gentleman. That's what he'd always wanted, to restore the family fortunes. And he did it. He'd been a generous benefactor of his local church, and he and the family got the prime position in front of the altar. But years later, there's a strange rumour. On his deathbed, a Cotswold vicar said, William Shakespeare went back to the old faith. As for his legacy to the world, that came a little later. 7 years after his death in 1623, his old friends Hemmings and Condell gathered together a collection of 37 of his plays, comedies, histories and tragedies. Many of them had already been printed in quarto over the years, including some of the most famous: Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Hemmings and Condell now added all those that had never been published, 16 plays that would have been lost forever without their efforts, and they put them together in a beautiful folio volume in whose pages is a new world of words, which even now, right across the world, we speak every day as part of our living language. And they did it as an act of love to their dear friend, and as an act of love for us, too.
At the front of the folio, Shakespeare's old friends and colleagues added a series of very sweet tributes to him. This is what they said. We have collected his plays without ambition either of self-profit or fame, only to keep the memory of so worthy a friend and fellow alive, as was our Shakespeare. But perhaps the most touching and most generous tribute came from his cantankerous old rival Ben Jonson, who said that his beloved Shakespeare had eclipsed even the greatest poets of ancient Greece and Rome. He was not of an age, but for all time.
When that I was and a little tiny boy, with hey ho, the wind and the rain, a foolish thing was but a toy for the rain.
So there you are. That's the end of our story, though of course his story will continue. The tale of a boy from a small English town, a boy who loved stories, plays and words. A teenage father who married and set out on his own to make it in the big world. A man who somewhere in himself found the capacity to express our deepest feelings as human beings, our joys and sorrows, our losses, and most of all, our love.
With hey ho, the wind and the rain, with tosspot still had drunk.
A man whose works are a bridge between the world we have lost and the world we have become.
It raineth every A great while ago, the world begun, with hey ho, the wind and the rain. But that's all one, our play is done, and we'll strive to please you every day.